William Shakespeare, an English playwright, poet, and actor, is widely considered the greatest writer in the English language and the world's foremost dramatist. His surviving works, totaling 39 plays, 154 sonnets, 3 long narrative poems, and a few other verses, have been translated into numerous languages and are performed more frequently than any other playwrights. Shakespeare remains a highly influential figure in the English language, and his works are continually studied and reinterpreted. Shakespeare was born and grew up in Stratford-upon-Avon, Warwickshire. At 18, he married Anne Hathaway, and they had 3 children, Susanna, and twins Hamlet and Judith. Between 1585 and 1592, he started a successful career in London as an actor, writer, and part owner of a playing company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which later became known as the King's Men. At 49, around 1613, he seems to have retired to Stratford and passed away 3 years later. Not many records of Shakespeare's personal life exist, leading to much speculation about his appearance, sexuality, religious beliefs, and the authorship of his works. Shakespeare created the majority of his known works from 1589 to 1613. His early plays were mainly comedies and histories, considered among the best in these genres. Afterward, he focused on tragedies until 1608, including Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, Othello, King Lear, and Macbeth, all considered some of the best works in English literature. In his later years, he wrote tragicomedies, also called romances, and worked with other playwrights. Shakespeare's plays were published in different quality editions while he was alive. But in 1623, 2 actor friends of Shakespeare, John Heminges and Henry Condell, released a more definitive version called The First Folio. It's a comprehensive posthumous collection of 36 of his plays. In its introduction, Ben Jonson, once a rival of Shakespeare, wrote a 4-sided poem praising Shakespeare with the famous line, "Not of an age, but for all time." Shakespeare's parents were John Shakespeare, a prosperous glove maker from Snitterfield in Warwickshire, and Mary Arden, the daughter of a wealthy landowning family. He was born in Stratford-upon-Avon and baptized on April 26, 1564. The exact date of his birth is unknown, but it is traditionally celebrated on April 23, St. George's Day. This date, suggested by William Oldies and George Stevens, is favored by biographers because Shakespeare also died on April 23, 1616. He was the 3rd of 8 children and the oldest surviving son. While no attendance records exist, most biographers believe Shakespeare likely attended the King's New School in Stratford, a free school established in 1553, located about a quarter-mile from his home. During the Elizabethan era, grammar schools had differing standards, but their curricula were mostly alike. The basic Latin text was standardized by royal decree, and the schools focused on providing a thorough education in grammar based on classical Latin authors. Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway when he was 18, and she was 26. The Diocese of Worcester's consistory court granted a marriage license on November 27, 1582. The following day, 2 of Hathaway's neighbors posted bonds ensuring there were no legal obstacles to the marriage. The wedding might have been rushed because the Worcester chancellor permitted the marriage banns to be read only once instead of the usual 3 times. 6 months later, Anne gave birth to a daughter named Susanna, baptized on May 26, 1583. Twins, a son named Hamlet and a daughter named Judith, were born almost 2 years later and were baptized on February 2, 1585. Unfortunately, Hamlet passed away at the age of 11 for unknown reasons and was buried on August 11, 1596. After the twins were born, there are few historical records of Shakespeare until he becomes part of the London theatre scene in 1592. An exception is his name appearing in a legal case, Complaints Bill, before the Queen's Bench Court at Westminster, dated Michaelmas Term 1588 and October 9, 1589. Scholars call the years between 1585 and 1590 to Shakespeare's lost years. Biographers trying to explain this time have shared numerous untrue stories. Nicholas Rowe, Shakespeare's first biographer, told a local legend from Stratford. It claimed that Shakespeare left the town for London to avoid being prosecuted for deer poaching in the estate of Thomas Lucy, a local squire. It's said that Shakespeare got back at Lucy by composing a disrespectful ballad about him. In another 18th century tale, Shakespeare begins his acting career by taking care of the horses of theatregoers in London. John Aubrey stated that Shakespeare worked as a rural schoolteacher. In the 20th century, some scholars proposed that Shakespeare could have worked as a schoolmaster for Alexander Houghton of Lancashire, a Catholic landowner who mentioned a certain William Shakespeare in his will. There's little evidence supporting these stories, mainly relying on hearsay gathered after Shakespeare's death, and Shakespeare was a common name in the Lancashire region. The exact start of Shakespeare's writing career is unknown, but references and performance records indicate that some of his plays were being performed in London by 1592. By that time, he was well known in London and even faced criticism in writing from playwright Robert Greene in his Groat's Worth of Wit in that year. Scholars have different interpretations of Greene's words, but generally, they agree that Greene accused Shakespeare of aspiring beyond his social status by competing with university-educated writers like Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Nash, and Greene himself. Greene's criticism is the oldest surviving mention of Shakespeare's work in the theater. Biographers propose that Shakespeare's career might have started anywhere from the mid-1580s to just before Greene's comments. From 1594 onward, only the Lord Chamberlain's Men, a company owned by a group of players, including Shakespeare, performed his plays, becoming the foremost playing company in London. Following Queen Elizabeth's death in 1603, the company received a royal patent from the new King James I and renamed itself the King's Men. In 1599, some members of the company formed a partnership and constructed their own theatre on the south bank of the River Thames, naming it the Globe. In 1608, the partnership acquired the Blackfriars Indoor Theatre as well. Remaining records of Shakespeare's property dealings and investments show that his involvement with the company brought him wealth. In 1597, he purchased New Place, the second largest house in Stratford, and in 1605, he invested in a share of the parish tithes in Stratford. Starting in 1594, some of Shakespeare's plays were published in quarto editions. By 1598, his name became a selling point and started appearing on the title pages. Even after finding success as a playwright, Shakespeare kept performing in his own and other plays. In the 1616 edition of Ben Jonson's works, Shakespeare is listed in the cast for Every Man in His Humour and Sejanus His Fall. Some scholars interpret Shakespeare's absence from the 1605 cast list for Jonson's Volpone as a signal that his acting career was winding down. The 1623 First Folio lists Shakespeare among the principal actors in all these plays. Some of these plays were performed after Volpone, but it's uncertain which roles he specifically played. In 1709, Rowe conveyed a tradition that Shakespeare played the ghost of Hamlet's father. Later traditions suggest that he also played Adam in As You Like It and the chorus in Henry V. However, scholars question the reliability of these sources. During his career, Shakespeare split his time between London and Stratford. In 1596, a year before he purchased New Place as his family home in Stratford, Shakespeare resided in the parish of St. Helens, Bishopsgate, north of the River Thames. He relocated to Southwark by 1599, the year his company built the Globe Theatre in that area. In 1604, he had shifted back north of the river to an area near St. Paul's Cathedral with numerous fine houses. There, he leased rooms from a French Huguenot named Christopher Mountjoy, who made women's wigs and other headgear. Nicholas Rowe, the initial biographer, documented the tradition, echoed by Samuel Johnson, that Shakespeare withdrew to Stratford some years before his death. He was still acting in London in 1608. In a response to a petition in 1635, Cuthbert Burbage mentioned that after buying the Blackfriars Theatre lease in 1608, the King's Men put men players there, including Hemminges, Condell, Shakespeare, etc. It's worth noting that the bubonic plague was widespread in London throughout 1609. The London public theatres were frequently shut down during prolonged outbreaks of the plague, leading to a lack of acting opportunities. At that time, it was rare for people to completely retire from all work. Shakespeare kept visiting London between 1611 and 1614. In 1612, he was a witness in Belet Mountjoy, a court case about the marriage settlement of Mountjoy's daughter, Mary. In March 1613, he purchased a gatehouse in the former Blackfriars Priory, and from November 1614, he stayed in London for several weeks with his son-in-law, John Hall. After 1610, Shakespeare wrote fewer plays, and none are credited to him after 1613. His final 3 plays were likely collaborations, probably with John Fletcher, who took over as the main playwright for The King's Men. He retired in 1613, before the Globe Theatre burned down during a performance of Henry VIII on June 29. Shakespeare passed away on April 23, 1616, at the age of 52. He passed away less than a month after signing his will, where he initially described himself as being in perfect health. There is no existing contemporary source that explains how or why he died. 50 years later, John Ward, the vicar of Stratford, noted in his notebook, Shakespeare, Drayton, and Ben Jonson had a merry meeting and, it seems, drank too hard, for Shakespeare died of a fever there contracted. While not impossible, it's noteworthy that Shakespeare was acquainted with Jonson and Drayton. He left behind his wife and 2 daughters. Susanna had married a physician, John Hall, in 1607, and Judith had married Thomas Quiney, a vintner, 2 months before Shakespeare passed away. Shakespeare signed his final will on March 25, 1616. The next day, his new son-in-law, Thomas Quiney, was found guilty of having an illegitimate son with Margaret Wheeler, who died during childbirth. Shakespeare left most of his substantial estate to his elder daughter Susanna with the condition that she passes it down in full to the first son of her body. The Quinneys had 3 children, all of whom died unmarried. The Halls had 1 child, Elizabeth, who married twice but passed away without children in 1670, bringing an end to Shakespeare's direct line. Shakespeare's will barely mentions his wife, Anne, who likely automatically received 1/3 of his estate. He did make sure to leave her my second best bed, a gift that has sparked a lot of speculation. Some scholars view the bequest as an insult to Anne, while others think that the second best bed might have been the marital bed, carrying significant meaning. Shakespeare was laid to rest in the chancel of Holy Trinity Church 2 days after he passed away. Before 1623, a memorial monument was built in his honor on the north wall of the Holy Trinity Church. It features a half-effigy of him writing. The plaque compares him to Nestor, Socrates, and Virgil. In 1623, along with the release of the first folio, the Droeshout engraving was also published. Shakespeare is remembered in various statues and memorials globally, including funeral monuments in Southwark Cathedral and Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. Like many playwrights of his time, Shakespeare collaborated with others, particularly in the early and late stages of his career, as most critics acknowledge. Shakespeare's earliest recorded works are Richard III and the 3 parts of Henry VI, written in the early 1590s during a trend for historical drama. Determining the exact dates of Shakespeare's plays is challenging, but analyses of the texts indicate that Titus Andronicus, The Comedy of Errors, The Taming of the Shrew, and The Two Gentlemen of Verona may also be from Shakespeare's early period. His initial historical plays, heavily influenced by the 1587 edition of Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland, depict the detrimental consequences of ineffective or corrupt governance and are seen as a support for the legitimacy of the Tudor dynasty. The early plays were shaped by the works of fellow Elizabethan playwrights like Thomas Kyd and Christopher Marlowe, as well as the traditions of medieval drama and the plays of Seneca. The Comedy of Errors followed classical models, and while no source has been identified for The Taming of the Shrew, it might be connected to a different play with the same name and could have originated from a folk story. Similar to The Two Gentlemen of Verona, where 2 friends seem to endorse rape, the storyline of The Taming of the Shrew, depicting the suppression of a woman's independence by a man, can be concerning to modern critics, directors, and audiences. Shakespeare's early comedies, which have tight double plots and precise comic sequences with classical and Italian influences, transitioned to a more romantic atmosphere in his most celebrated comedies around the mid-1590s. A Midsummer Night's Dream is a clever blend of romance, fairy magic, and humorous low-life scenes. Shakespeare's subsequent romantic comedy, The Merchant of Venice, includes a depiction of the vengeful Jewish moneylender Shylock. This portrayal aligns with prevailing Elizabethan perspectives, but might be seen as offensive by modern audiences. The cleverness and wordplay in Much Ado About Nothing, the delightful rural setting of As You Like It, and the lively festivities in Twelfth Night mark the culmination of Shakespeare's series of great comedies. Following the lyrical Richard II, written mostly in verse, Shakespeare introduced comedic prose into the histories of the late 1590s with Henry IV, Parts 1 and 2, and Henry V. As Shakespeare transitions skillfully between funny and serious scenes, prose and poetry, his characters become more intricate and tender, showcasing the narrative variety seen in his mature work. This period starts and finishes with two tragedies, Romeo and Juliet, the well-known romantic tragedy of youthful passion, love, and death, and Julius Caesar, based on Sir Thomas North's 1579 translation of Plutarch's Parallel Lives, introducing a new kind of drama. According to Shakespearean scholar James Shapiro, in Julius Caesar, different elements like politics, character, personal reflections, and contemporary events started to blend and influence each other. In the early 17th century, Shakespeare penned the so-called problem plays Measure for Measure, Troilus and Cressida, and All's Well That Ends Well, along with several of his most famous tragedies. Many critics think that Shakespeare's greatest tragedies showcase the pinnacle of his artistic achievements. The main character of one of Shakespeare's greatest tragedies, Hamlet, has likely been analyzed more than any other Shakespearean character, particularly for his famous soliloquy that starts with "to be or not to be. That is the question." In contrast to the introspective Hamlet, whose critical flaw is indecision, the protagonists of the subsequent tragedies, Othello and King Lear, meet their downfall due to impulsive errors in judgment. The stories of Shakespeare's tragedies frequently revolve around critical mistakes or flaws that disrupt order and lead to the downfall of the hero and those close to them. In Othello, the villain Iago manipulates Othello's sexual jealousy to the extent that Othello kills his innocent and loving wife. In King Lear, the elderly king makes a tragic mistake by relinquishing his powers, setting off a chain of events that result in the torture and blinding of the Earl of Gloucester and the murder of Lear's youngest daughter, Cordelia. In Macbeth, Shakespeare's shortest and most condensed tragedy, insatiable ambition drives Macbeth and his wife, Lady Macbeth, to kill the rightful king and take over the throne, but their guilt ultimately leads to their own destruction. In this play, Shakespeare introduces a supernatural element to the tragic storyline. His final major tragedies, Antony and Cleopatra and Coriolanus, feature some of Shakespeare's best poetry and were regarded as his most accomplished tragedies. In his last phase, Shakespeare shifted to romance or tragicomedy, crafting three more significant plays, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest, along with the collaborative work, Pericles, Prince of Tyre. Less grim than the tragedies, these four plays have a more serious tone than the comedies from the 1590s. However, they conclude with reconciliation and the forgiveness of potentially tragic mistakes. Some analysts view this shift in mood as a sign of Shakespeare adopting a more serene outlook on life, but it could also be a reflection of the prevailing theatrical trends of the time. Shakespeare worked together with John Fletcher on two more plays that still exist, Henry VIII and The Two Noble Kinsmen. Be not afraid of greatness. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and others have greatness thrust upon them. We know what we are, but not what we may be. Words are easy, like the wind. Faithful friends are hard to find.